Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video from Mark chapter 16, the discussion entitled, Is This Really the End? Before we get into the passage itself, I wanted to put in a plug for the personal reading guide. Those of you who have been faithfully doing this, I think are going to be pleased as you make your move into trying to pull together the threads of Mark at this point. It's really helpful to have even a brief summary of some of the things that God has been showing you, and some of the things he's been saying to you. And so I encourage you to encourage your group to bring their guides to the next study or whenever you're doing the review so that you can pull things together. I do strongly encourage you to do the review. Don't just quit at Mark 16. You're not done until you've had some time to kind of think together about what it is that God has shown you. And so whether you do that as a part of this Mark 16 study, which is relatively brief, or if you want to do it next week during the scheduled time for it, then that's fine as well. But definitely take some time to do the review. Okay, some helps with this study, because I'm not going to go question by question on the study as much as try to give some helpful hints, things that might help you in terms of thinking about this passage and discussing it and leading people into it. First thing that I want to encourage you to do is to help the people in your group to get inside the disciples' skin, to try to imagine what it would have been like to be the disciples in this situation. Now, you can do this anytime you're reading the Gospels, but the reason I think it's especially appropriate at this point is there's not a ton of text here. You're only doing 8 verses, or possibly 20 if you want to do the longer ending of Mark. But part of the way that we're able to observe well is to kind of project ourselves into the passage. Now, not everything that a person imagines is true. And so part of what you're doing as you kind of put yourself into their place is you're still comparing some of what you imagine against the actual text to see, does it fit the text? Does anything in the text contradict it? Does it seem like it fills out the text, or does it feel like it goes in a different direction than the text? So the best way to use your imagination is as an aid to observation, as a way of helping you to see the passage with fresh eyes. Okay, number 2, let's talk about the ending of Mark. The earliest manuscripts in Mark end at verse 8. And so some of your Bibles don't even have verses 9 through 20, or they're tucked away in a footnote or in a separate section. But if you have an old King James Bible, or a New King James Bible actually, the passage goes all the way to verse 20. What's going on there? During the time that the King James Version was translated, the manuscripts, the best manuscripts that they had at the time, went all the way through verse 20. But, in the intervening 400 years or so, they've discovered a lot of additional manuscripts, some of them considerably older than the manuscripts that were used to translate the King James Version. And so these older manuscripts don't have the longer ending. So that's one clue that perhaps the originals didn't have it either. If the originals had the longer ending, then why wouldn't the older manuscripts have that ending? How does it suddenly appear later? So that's one way of thinking about it. Easier to think that originally the ending was short and kind of odd, and so somebody felt the need to fill out the ending a little bit. You'll notice that almost everything in verses 9 through 20 appears elsewhere in the Gospels and Acts. So it appears in Matthew, Luke, or John, or Acts. So that says a couple of things. One, it says that everything in here is still true. The other thing that it tells us, though, is that it would have been easy for somebody who wanted to have a more suitable ending to just add one based on other things that are in the scripture. One last piece of evidence that you might want to consider is that there are 167 words in these verses. 73 of them, almost half, don't appear anywhere else in the entire Gospel of Mark. So what that tells us is there's a significant change here in terms of vocabulary and style. It seems like someone else wrote this part of the book and added it on to the end, probably because the end was a bit puzzling. To have it end with, so they went out and fled from the tomb for terror, and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That doesn't seem like a very triumphant ending, and it seems a little confusing. Like there are all these questions, if the women said nothing because they were afraid, then how did the word get out? Did they finally overcome their fear? And one would think that Mark knew what had happened, so why doesn't he include that here? Some people believe that the real ending of Mark got lost, but I don't think so. If you've been following along in Mark pretty carefully, you know that he loves to set up these sort of open-ended situations. Jesus will tell a parable and then not explain it, that kind of thing. And this is a kind of a parable-like ending. I believe that it's meant to cause us to come back to God and to ask, gosh, what does this mean? I think also, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the gospel, in 1:1, it talks about the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And I think what you find here at the ending of the book is that this is not really an ending at all. This whole book is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then the pregnant question then is, how is it going to end? And what is our role going to be in that? You'll see that in the application questions, because I think that's the question that Mark is begging of us, is to know, how are we going to respond? What role are we going to play in this story of the gospel of the kingdom? Okay, so to kind of summarize there are two endings of Mark. You can end at verse 8, which I think is actually the original ending. You can end at verse 20, which I think was tacked on, but is still true. I do think, though, it's worth making the distinction about where is the original ending of Mark, because it helps us to sort of get a feel for what Mark was doing. And then this extra part here, I shouldn't say extra, but the additional part, I think is all still edifying for us, just not the original ending of Mark. Okay, so third thing to consider. One of the things that you'll find when you're looking at this passage is all kinds of evidence about Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, some of this may be old hat to you. You became a Christian a long time ago. You've been all through this, and you already believe, and that's fine. But two things to consider. One, not everyone in your group may be a believer, or even if they are, they may never have really thought about the evidence for Jesus's literally rising from the dead. And the fact that at the end of chapter 15, there are all these witnesses to his death, and they kind of double check it, and then he's buried, and then you've got witnesses again when they come back to the tomb. And I think all of this can lead to a very helpful and interesting discussion about the evidences for the resurrection, because the resurrection is super important. It is not just an optional spiritual belief. It is the bedrock fact on which Christianity is built. With no resurrection, then Jesus becomes just another guy, um, and not an honest guy at that, because he predicts his resurrection. So super crucial, and I think even if everybody in your group is a Christian, it may be worth digging into some of those evidences, because sooner or later you might end up talking to someone about that, and it's just good to have some facility with the actual facts. So I encourage you to do that. So that was number 3. Number 4 is this passage has several Old Testament reference. You might be interested in looking up some of these. Many of these fall in that second half of the chapter. Isaiah 35, 5 through 6 is the passage about speaking with other tongues. So you can look at the original context there, see what Isaiah meant and how it's being adapted in the New Testament. Isaiah 43, verse 10 talks about God's people being his witnesses. And so, again, definitely worth seeing in its context and understanding what he meant by that. And then Psalm 110, verse 1, which talks about being seated at the right hand of God. So always good to know the Old Testament background on these things. Last thing I'll say is this passage, which is not a super long passage, is full of spiritual lessons, talking about and thinking about what it's like to come back from failure. You note this verse 7, go and tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. Now, Jesus had already told them that in Mark 14:28. I see there's a typo here in the guide. It says 14:27. It's actually 14:28. But he had already told them this, so he wouldn't have had to have this man repeat it. But he does, and he names Peter, who had been predicted to deny Jesus 3 times, and then had actually done that. And you just think about what that's like for Peter, who had been a very close friend of Jesus, to fail him in that way, and then to be personally invited to come back from failure, that failure doesn't have to be the last word. There's a question about how we deal with fear. Fear happens, and we see it right here over and over again. It says in verse 5 that they were alarmed. Of course, the guy tells them, don't be alarmed, but in verse 8 it says that they fled from the tomb for terror, and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And what is it that we're afraid of? What are the things that keep us from being faithful to God, from obeying his word to us? What are we afraid of, and how can we move past that fear in faith? A last thing that you could talk about here in this final section is about authentication. This person lays out these signs that will follow the believers, including healing, deliverance, and a whole bunch of other signs. Are those signs still active today? And do you see them in your life? Whether you do or not, what are the signs in your life that confirm the message of Jesus? Well, I've laid out a number of application questions for you. Please make sure you get to application. But one interesting question, I think, is this one about what is your Galilee? What is the thing that God has commanded you to do or to go to that doesn't quite make sense to you? Maybe that you're too afraid to take a step. And yet he has promised to meet you there. And what would it look like to say yes to God in that? How can your friends pray for you? How can they encourage you to be faithful? Well, you've made it to the end of Mark, but we still have the review, so don't give up. One more study, one more discussion about Mark, but I hope that it's been a good tour through Mark, and that you're getting everything that God has for you. Look forward next week to wrapping things up and getting it all down together.